So tonight, we're going to talk about Machiavelli and ask our guest the question, was Machiavelli actually Machiavellian? And so we'll have to define some of that, these terms as we're understanding them. I'll mention if we, because of our audience is joining us online, if you have questions or brief comments, we need to pass you the microphone so that you can speak in the microphone. I know everyone in the room can probably hear you, but people online also want to hear all the great comments and questions that you guys inevitably have. So, on the idea of Machiavellianism, William Shakespeare in 1591 wrote a play, Henry VI, Part 3, which is part of a series of plays on the War of the Roses, which includes this very famous character, Richard III. Shakespeare's Richard III is a villain or anti-hero. He is wholly amoral. He embodies evil and he'll commit any crime to secure his own power. And he's got a great soliloquy here where he's speaking to the audience. You know, he says, "Why, I can smile and I can murder while I smile. I can cry content to that which grieves my heart and wet my cheeks with artificial tears and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than a mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than a basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and, like a Sinon, take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut. Were it further off, I'll pluck it down." So Machiavel obviously is, anyway, you can say maybe the teacher of all of the politicians and rulers that are like this. And Richard here is arguing or boasting that he could actually school Machiavel. So almost then, immediately after its publication, which is 19 years after it had been written and 5 years after Machiavelli's death, the Prince was extremely well known and influential, positively but also quite negatively. So in other words, many people had a lot of influence in that people wrote large, long rejections of it and all of its precepts and all that sort of thing. On the other hand, it excited the minds of a lot of people as well and no doubt made them think of new things. So Machiavellianism had already then become synonymous with evil, and Machiavelli himself with Satan even. And so the idea in English, there's a nickname for Satan called Old Nick, and people assumed that comes from Niccolò Machiavelli and made that comparison all the time. It's not actually true. So the nickname is attested in a century before Machiavelli wrote. But in any event, you can kind of have the impression that that this excited everybody's minds on this. So in that time period, then Protestants accused Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, who had all of this power over her three sons who were kings. They accused her of using the Prince as her guidebook, and indeed the book had been dedicated to members of her family, her father. In particular, she was proclaimed, for example, for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, where thousands of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, were killed in Paris. Not to be outdone, the Catholics, in turn, accused Henry VIII, also a very not known for being the most pious and honorable king, for using Machiavelli as his model for all of the self-interested policies that he had, including things like cutting ties to Rome, setting himself up as the head of the Church of England, dissolving all of the monasteries in the realm, and confiscating all the property to enrich himself, in addition to divorcing and or executing a succession of wives. Henry's cousin, Reginald Pole, who was very biased, nevertheless also said that he had seen the king with a copy of The Prince and speaking very highly of Machiavelli. So essentially it's all in the air in this centuries after it's published. So historically, Machiavellianism has come to mean that effectiveness alone counts in politics, that political actions shouldn't be restricted to considerations of morality, good or ill, And the charge of Machiavellianism has been applied to politicians who employ public duplicity, who appear amoral, who seem to act out of personal self-interest as opposed to the public's interests. And so Nixon here is often charged with it, and one of the reasons that, anyway, to back up that charge is we know what he was saying in public all the time, and now we also have all these tapes, and the tapes are hypnotic. You don't want to listen to it. It's horrible to listen to, but you just can't even believe, as he's swearing up a storm and saying all of these horrible things and bigoted things and all kinds of crazy paranoid things that he has. So anyway, he's in a very different place than what he's, his public persona. Beyond the political realm, then, Machiavellianism as an idea describes individuals then who are acting duplicitously, arguing that ends justifies the means. And so in other words, even though the prince really is referring to politics and is meant as, like, say, political theory and for heads of state, politicians, nevertheless, people read it and immediately kind of see it as a guidebook for interpersonal activities, or have seen it that way, or as a negative guidebook maybe. And so, for example, in our reality TV shows that are popular in this century, all of these sorts of behavior that people have, like to win at Survivor, for example, by betraying their alliances and things like that, involve, essentially ends justify the means sort of duplicity in order for they to be the winner, right? So, in some sense, it can be argued that this maybe, is the nature of politics. So, in that sense, then, if it's just about, let's say, compromising what's, let's say, conventional morals, while you are the head of a state or a politician, politicians all lie, maybe to some sense or other, then Machiavellianism long predated Machiavelli. And going all the way back then to Euripides in the play The Phoenician Women, there's a line that says, "If wrong may e'er be right, for a throne's sake were wrong most right, be God in all else feared." So the idea there, it's kind of an old-timey translation. I was trying to find a newer one of that translation. But the idea here is, if there's ever, like relativism in terms of, when right is wrong, it's definitely when we were talking about seizing power, seizing a throne. Yeah, please go ahead and come in. Thanks. Yeah, nice turnout. So we filled out all the chairs already. Anyway, Thucydides, is also in ancient Greece here, has similar sentiments when he has a dialogue between the Athenians and the Melians in the 5th book of the Peloponnesian War, the history of the Peloponnesian War. So in other words, this idea then that people sacrifice, let's say, conventional right and wrong for purposes of state. There's other ancient examples. So the Arthashastra, an ancient Sanskrit text on statecraft. This happens when the air conditioner comes on. So one sec. So that'll be nice. We'll have more air conditioning. Okay. Gives a lot of advice that modern readers have then called Machiavellian, and so got charged in the early 20th century when it was translated into English and says, "Whoa, this stuff is really Machiavellian." So an example of that is, here's an advice that the Arthashastra gives to a leader who wants to undermine an enemy's ruling oligarchy. So he advises to undermine the ruling oligarchy, make the chiefs of the enemy's ruling council infatuated with women possessed of great beauty and youth. When passion is roused in them, they should start quarrels by creating belief about their love in one and by going to another. So in other words, they're getting all excited about who's cheating on who with all of the women. And so this is a good way to use an advice to how to screw up your enemy. Another one, for example, in the Arthashastra, compares levying taxes to picking fruit. So it says, "As one picks ripe fruit after another from a garden, so should the king from his kingdom. Out of fear for his own destruction, he should avoid unripe ones, which give rise to revolt." So if you're going around and picking all the unripe fruit, then that's obviously going to make the tree isn't going to produce anymore. It's bad. So in all of these kind of precepts that this text is giving. It's kind of making, let's say, practical advice as opposed to moral-based advice. Another one of these, from Pseudo-Aristotle, is, again, this idea that leaders have to put private morality aside for reasons of state. It's ostensibly a letter from Aristotle to Alexander the Great entitled The Secret of Secrets. And one of the best ways to make your book really popular is to have your book say the secret, like 7 secrets of successful people or whatever you're going to say. Numbers are really good too. But anyway, not only is this a secret, it's the secret of secrets. And you might as well, for good measure, say it was by Aristotle. It made it maybe the most popular book in the Latin West in the Middle Ages as a result of a great title and a great pretended author. So it's translated into Latin in the 12th century. It's likely composed by composed in Arabic 2 centuries earlier, and it was a big sensation. Roger Bacon, in all of his different writings, he actually quotes from this book more than any other book. Okay, there's a difference, though, between all of that antiquity all through the Middle Ages in terms of these kind of political theories. So even if it's practical, even if it's saying you can set aside conventional morals and customs and things like that, and you might have to as a leader, that is always done in terms of in defense of a greater good. So in other words, it's to be done because it's to protect and to foster the peace and integrity of the state. So in other words, there is a greater goal in mind in understanding the need for a little bit of realpolitik. By contrast, what seems to be anyway, when you read The Prince, Machiavelli isn't really saying, not only is he very candid in expressing all the different evils that leaders may have to do, and he advises leaders to do, but they're not for the sake of the state, but rather for the self-interest of the leader. Okay, so who was Machiavelli? Niccolò Machiavelli was a Florentine, a diplomat, a politician, a historian, poet, philosopher, playwright, humanist, so a Renaissance guy, right? If you're going to be all of those things. Born in 1469 in Florence, he rose to become one of the senior officials in the Florentine Republic. And between 1503 and 1506, Machiavelli was in charge of the Florentine militia, which is something that he really it was a position really dear to his heart. So it's something that he really wanted to do, as we read in the Prince, and he talks about what he thinks of in terms of citizen armies as opposed to mercenary armies that were otherwise employed by most Italian states, and what the Florentines had been using before they organized a citizen militia in this time. And so this is written later when he writes The Prince. He explains his theory on mercenaries. So he writes, "Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. And if one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men, and destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is. For in peace, one is robbed by them." You have to continuously pay them in peacetime. "And in war, by the enemy, because they're not interested in dying for you or anything like that. So they'll just as easily flip sides. They are ready enough to be your soldiers whilst you do not make war, but if war comes, they take to themselves off or run from the foe, which I should have little trouble to prove, for the ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than by resting all her hopes for many years on mercenaries." And then he goes through and cites all these different examples. But essentially, it's better off not having any army at all than having mercenaries as far as he's concerned. So the context or the background of Machiavelli writing is in Italy that has been divided into small warring principalities and republics. So he's here in Tuscany and the Republic of Florence, although the rest of Tuscany is actually not even entirely unified, because there's also the Republic of Siena and the Republic of Lucca. And so you can see that there's all these other ones. Wedged between that, the Papal States, the bigger states, Naples, Milan, Venice, and so on. all these states then frequently hired mercenary armies to fight each other, and specifically they would get engaged in different alliances where a bunch of the states would be all aligned against the other ones, and then it would change, and so the alliances would shift, and the war would continue with different sides fighting different sides. And even more to the point, what was continuously happening is that the wars that were going on in Italy were either drawing in, or, depending on how you look at it, the exterior powers, greater powers, were continuously coming in to fight proxy wars or to take control of Italian territories that they wanted. So specifically France up here, Spain, which would come this way, and the Holy Roman Empire were constantly coming into Italy and taking control of different states. So in 1512, the Medici family, backed by Pope Julius II, so this warrior pope, but he also is the Michelangelo's pope, so the Sistine Chapel, the person who kind of built the new St. Peter's, used Spanish mercenaries to attack the Florentine Republic. After the Medici victory, the Republic is dissolved and Florence became a principality. And so when that happened, Machiavelli, who was a senior statesman in the Florentine Republic, was out of a job. And in the following year, 1513, he's accused of being part of an anti-Medici conspiracy. And from that, he was arrested and tortured. For 3 weeks, he denied his involvement and was ultimately released. He then retired to an estate outside of Florence, but continually hoped that he would eventually be restored to his former job, or maybe even a better job. And so in that same year that all of that happened, 1513, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and presumably wrote it actually fairly quickly, with the idea of presenting it to the new Medici ruler, Giuliano. In its present form, the form that we have it, it's been revised and dedicated to Lorenzo II, who took power after his uncle's death in 1516. So we kind of, in doing it, thought maybe the next Medici ruler would also possibly want to look at this book and see in it that Machiavelli would be worth having as an advisor. So what is The Prince? The Prince is a very brief book written in the Italian vernacular. It's written part of a traditional genre known as a mirror for princes, where courtiers and sages, philosophers, write short treatises that give advice to monarchs. And so that had been happening all the way back into antiquity. However, in contrast to all of the previous examples which exhort monarchs to idealism and to be good and just rulers and all of the great qualities of a good ruler and what those all are, Machiavelli's work is shockingly candid in its advocacy of realism and, in fact, the need and necessity of doing all sorts of immoral or seemingly immoral or evil acts. One of the previous examples, anyway, in terms of these mirrors for princes, would have been that when princes actually did all the things, they wouldn't be able to. I mean, they weren't actually. I'm trying to think of the name of it. The guy who was the king of England, who more or less is the cause of the War of the Roses. And so I should have just been thinking about this before. But anyway, essentially, because he didn't have any of the evil will. No, not Richard II. The one that caused it all. Edward the. Yes, probably. Anyway, he was essentially, it's Henry V's son, who was an infinite. Yeah. So. Yeah. Anyway, the point of it was that he did every single thing that like one of these mirrors of princes wanted you to do. He was, he was giving. He was always forgiving of everything. But the problem with it was that he didn't have any will of his own, and so anybody who came into the room, they would ask him for something, he'd sign it and give it to them. And so he ended up ultimately, like, say, for example, making two people the Duke of Cornwall or something like that. And so people had to then fight it out. In other words, anybody who had control of the king at a certain point was also in charge. So you also needed to have, in that case, the mirror for princes genre, fell apart when the prince didn't innately have some of these things that Machiavelli is now talking about. So in keeping with his idea of realism, Machiavelli then uses historical examples to back up each of his candid political propositions. And I would argue in like true Renaissance style, all of Machiavelli's historical examples are drawn from classical antiquity, Greek and Roman past, or from immediate current events. And so he will talk about something in the last couple generations or something in Greek and Roman times, but he avoids any discussion of anything that happened in between because Renaissance people have decided that they really don't care about the time period that happened before that they start calling the Middle Ages, and they don't see anything in themselves in it because they have decided that they are the classical age born anew. And so more or less every one of these examples that Machiavelli has will take something from antiquity and something from the present. So as we look at this little book and look at its structure, Machiavelli starts out by noting, when you're going to start talking about states, there's two types of states, republics and principalities. And the prince, obviously, he's only going to be talking about the principalities. He divides principalities then into ones that are hereditary, or ones that are new, or ones that he calls mixed, where mixed ones where you have inherited a state, say, and now you've conquered another state, and so you've added to your original state a new territory, so it becomes mixed. He then considers the consequences to the prince of how that state was acquired, either by the prince's virtue, by fortune, which is to say someone else's virtue. If someone else, for example, as with it's kind of a mixture here with the Medicis, because essentially Julius II, who's a pope, and the Spanish mercenaries are the ones that defeat the Florentines and put the Medicis back into power. But they also are sort of reacquiring a monarchy or a principality that they'd sort of ruled before in previous generations, and so in some ways it's hereditary. And then also he talks about people who are able to get a hold of states by what he calls criminal virtue. And then also whether or not people, where your peers all select you to be the leader. So if you were part of the civic nobility and you get chosen to be a leader. The criminal virtue one is where, again, he is now pulling into relatively uncharted territory in terms of what anybody talked about. But he says the reality is sometimes people are able to find themselves in charge of a state because they successfully kill the previous prince, and now they're the one in charge. And one of the most practical pieces of advice that I think shows that Machiavelli has a pretty good grasp of human nature is that he says that if you are going to be one of these princes that finds himself in charge of a state because of, let's say, your criminal virtue, then what you have to do right at the start is add up all of the evil things you're going to ever have to do in order to consolidate the state, and just do it all at once in one kind of big, massacre. And because then the people over time, once things are secure and everybody's kind of going around and you're not doing that every week, then people will forget and forgive, and they'll just go on with their lives, and now you're more or less trusted again as a you have this bad thing that marred your past, the whole big massacre, but at the very least now that's not happening anymore, and so therefore people get over it. Whereas if you don't do that, and instead every week you can commit a new little tiny atrocity, and it may well be over the course of 10 years that your weekly tiny atrocities never even add up to the one big one that you did, what the other guy did, people will be so irritated by this continual wound that they won't find themselves safe, and they'll get rid of you, right? So anyway, so that shows, I think, that one actually is one that does work in regular people life too. So if you're going to, so for example, I was thinking that if you as a regular person, have a rich aunt, and you're just constantly begging her for little amounts of money and things like that, and that's all you ever do, it's try to get money out of her or whatever, she's going to get tired of you. And at a certain point, she's just going to be, fed up that you've asked her all the time for $5 here and $5 there and things like that. And that's it. Whereas if you had just been really nice and waited until like some major, point, like where, like you have you need a college something for college, and suddenly you need $40,000 or whatever. Well, she might write you that check, and it would have been so much, you would have gotten so much more money anyway. So anyway, I think that's human nature. Okay, so Machiavelli, this is just to give us kind of a sense of how he's talking, both in terms of his political analysis, and then his use of examples, both contemporary and then ancient examples, right? So when he's talking about these mixed states, where that are not entirely inherited, right? So he says there are two of these examples in our time are the Turk, which is the language he uses for the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and the King of France. The entire monarchy of the Turk is governed by one lord. The others are his servants, and dividing his kingdom into sanjaks, he sends their different administrators and shifts and changes them as he chooses, right? So the whole Ottoman Empire is divided into little provinces called sanjaks, all of whom have officials that are appointed directly from the Sultan. And they can also be removed and revoked and switched around. The King of France is placed, however, in the midst of an ancient body of lords, acknowledged by their own subjects and beloved by them. They have their own prerogatives, and nor can the king take these away except at his peril. So the King of France has all of these nobles, the Count of Anjou, the Dutch Duke of Berry, et cetera, et cetera. You can't simply just say, you're no longer Duke of Berry, I'm going to appoint some new official, because that person's lineage goes all the way back, right? And so it's this feudalism, and it's very hard to take any one of those guys down, right? Therefore, who considers both of these states will recognize great difficulties in seizing the state of the Turk, but once it's conquered, great ease in holding it. And so I'll explain why that is. The cause of the difficulties in seizing the kingdom of the Turk are that the usurper cannot be called in by the princes of the kingdom. So there's no Duke of Burgundy, like the King of France had, who is this great, almost king himself of the whole area between France and Germany and in the lowlands, who continually in the wars of in the 100 Years' War was constantly allied with the English king, and one of the reasons why the English were constantly winning in the war, the 100 Years' War, is because they had these allies of these great lords within France, right? So none of these little guys who were officials from the Ottoman Sultanate and heads of sanjaks, none of those are in those positions where they can just call you in because they don't have an independent power base, right? So, nor can he hope to be assisted in his designs by the revolt of those whom the Lord has around him. So all of these little officials, they owe everything to the Sultan, and they aren't prepared to rebel. Hence, he who attacks the Turk must bear in mind that he will find him united. So all of the Ottoman Empire will be united, and the attacker, that would be the guy who would want to replace and conquer the Sultanate, will have to rely more on his own strength than on the revolt of others. But if once the Turk has been conquered and he isn't able to replenish his armies or anything like that, there is nothing to fear but the family of this prince, and this being exterminated. So if you kill all the entire family of the Ottoman sultans, there remains no one to fear, as all of the other officials have no credit with the people, and as the conqueror did not rely on any of these lesser officials or on the people in order to get his victory, he doesn't have anything to fear from any of them afterwards, right? So you can just poop him in, and now he's sultan. The contrary happens in kingdoms governed like that of France, because one can easily enter there by gaining over some baron of the kingdom. So you walk into Burgundy, the Duke of Burgundy welcomes you in, no trouble at all. One always finds malcontents and such that desire change. Such men, for the reasons given, can open the way into the state and render the victory easy. But if you want to hold France then afterwards, you meet with infinite difficulties, both from those who have assisted you. You always have the Duke of Burgundy bugging you, and from those you crushed. Nor is it enough for you to exterminate the family of the prince, because the lords that remain themselves, the heads of fresh movements against you. So in other words, the Duke of Burgundy thinks, well, I could be king of France now. So it's not just there's not just only one line. And so you're either unable to satisfy or exterminate them, and as you are unable to either satisfy them or exterminate them, that state is lost whenever time brings the opportunity, right? So you can't hold it very easily. It's easy to get in there, it's hard to hold it. Now, so then he has those. Those are the contemporary examples he has on this topics, this idea that he has. Now, if you'll consider what was the nature of the government of Darius, so the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Now he's going back into the classical history for another example. You'll find it similar to that of the Turk. And therefore, it was only necessary for Alexander the Great first to overthrow Darius and the Persians in the field. So they came together as an army, they obliterated the army, then to take the country for him. After which victory, Darius having been killed, the state remained secure to Alexander for the above reasons. So once he killed Darius off and exterminated the Persian royal family, then it's very easy for Alexander to hold the empire, because all those satraps were able to just report now to Alexander, right? But it's impossible to hold with such tranquility states constituted like that of France. Hence arose those frequent rebellions against the Romans in Spain, in France, and Greece, owing to the many principalities that were there in these states, of which, as long as the memory of them endured, the Romans always held insecure possession. And he goes on to say that it was only after just generations and generations of it being Roman that people forgot about it, and the Romans were able to make it just be Rome. So, okay, so next, from that kind of a point where we're talking about the different types of states and how you get them, Machiavelli next considers the different kinds. I guess we're now talking about another kind of different kinds, which is to say states that are, for example, ecclesiastical principalities, like the papal states, then controlled by the Medici Pope Leo X, are among the easiest for a prince to hold on to. He makes that case. So essentially, he has drawn a distinction in his particular Italian context of states where they're run essentially by the church, of which the papal state is a very important example. And one of the reasons why he's probably talking about that is that he's writing this book to a Medici prince, and that Medici prince has a relative, kind of a cousin, who is also now pope. And so the Medici have this interesting opportunity, as Machiavelli sees it, given that they control two of these states in Italy. Next section, Machiavelli considers what qualities are needed for a prince to be effective. And that's a normal part of these Mirror for Princes books, but as we kind of have already said, he ends up listing a very different set of qualities than the moral traits that are normally urged in Mirrors for Princes. So essentially, Machiavelli has said, while a prince ideally should be virtuous, he argues that the needs of the state will not allow him to be truly virtuous, and so therefore what's really all that's necessary is that for the prince has to kind of appear virtuous. He goes on to say that, as he's just going through the different qualities, he's kind of getting to the argument, well, should you be? I mean, one of the qualities of kings is often that kings are supposed to constantly be generous and being a font to the, of gifts to their people. Machiavelli says, okay, that's really nice in theory, but you're going to end up bankrupting yourself and the state. And at a certain point, you either have to raise taxes, which will make everybody really upset, or you'll have to get funds from some other place, or eventually you were generous and now you stopped giving, and people really don't like that. So it's better if you can have a reputation that you're sort of generous, but you can actually be parsimonious and never actually give anything out. That's probably better. And if you're just known for being cheap, then that's ultimately not going to disappoint people, or they would like it otherwise, but it'd be much more ruinous to be generous. And he also goes through the very famous one of arguing, well, is it better to be loved or to be feared? And since you can't often be both, concludes that it's actually better to be feared for a couple reasons. And so here's an excerpt that talks about that. I know that many have written on this point. I expect I shall be considered presumptuous in mentioning it again, especially as in discussing it, I shall depart from the methods of other people. So he's very clear or very aware what the model here of Mirror for Princes normally does, right? So normally people do list off all the qualities that a monarch is supposed to have: generosity, honesty, integrity, being good and truthful, everything like that. But he is going to have a different set of these. But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to be, to me, more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities, which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than preservation. And so this is essentially talking about, I mean, actually very contemporaneously is the More's Utopia. That people have been writing, what an ideal state should be like, and people have been saying how you ought to live. But Machiavelli finds anyway that in real politics, in his view, it's so diverged from that if you spend your time worrying about what you ought to do, you're going to be quickly ruined instead of what you need to do, what you have to do. For a man who wishes to act entirely upon his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. So everybody else is around to evil. If you're going to sit around and be good, you're going down. Hence, it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong and to make use of it or not according to necessity. Therefore, putting on one side imaginary things concerning a prince and discussing those which are real, so he's really being clear with what his goal here and why it's so different. I say that all men, when they are spoken of, are remarkable from some of those qualities which bring them either blame or praise. And so then he goes on off to list all of those qualities about that you're either praised for or blamed for. But because all of the qualities that he just listed can neither be entirely possessed nor observed, for human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be sufficiently prudent that he knows how to avoid reproach for those vices which would lose him his state. So if you're continuously doing things that are that you're going to be, the people you're dishonorable, you're constantly breaking your word, all of those kind of things, you need to know how to not get in trouble for that, and to the extent that you'll, lose the state. So, next we have this idea then that he goes into, it is better to be feared than loved. So Machiavelli states that it's important to avoid, after that feared than loved and deciding that it's feared, he says that it's also, though, really important to avoid becoming despised, right? Which is beyond feared. Feared is good, despised is bad. So he points out that this, though, is really easily done, and he repeats this several times. Stay off of people's property and women, men's property and women. He's only thinking of people as men. So anyway, and so in other ways, if that's the thing that people ultimately, property is what people are ultimately going to be really upset about. And so then after a potpourri of other minor topics like the utility of fortresses, Machiavelli talks about the prince's need for choosing good ministers and especially avoiding flatterers. And so you can imagine that this is you're kind of getting into his qualities here, right? So he's not being a flatterer and all of this kind of thing like so many yes men that unfortunately are around everybody. And he goes through a whole bunch of classical examples like Commodus here of rulers who make themselves despised and lose their states as a result of that. So Machiavelli ends his book by arguing that while most princes who lose their states tend to blame fortune, so, oh, woe is me, look at all this misfortune that I have. I mean, the traditional picture here of the wheel of fortune here is blindfolded, and you can kind of see that lowly people are being raised up to being kings, but then as the wheel continues to turn, they fall, right? He actually argues that the true cause is most likely to be sloth, so just becoming lazy and not paying attention, once you're already on top. Arguing that while his analogy is, while of course when the flood comes, there's very little that you can do, right? So you can't build up levees essentially when the city is already being flooded and underwater. However, you could have spent, the entire dry season building up levees. So another fate is bringing all sorts of misfortunes. Some of these can be planned for if you're not being a lazy prince. So then finally, he has a chapter that is an exhortation for an Italian prince, specifically here a Medici prince, to emerge, who would drive out from the peninsula then these forces of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. So kind of looking then at that structure of the book, then we come to that kind of question that we kind of opposed here then, was Machiavelli Machiavellian? And in some sense we're I mean, there's all kinds of multiple answers, and people have had all the different answers, and so I'm not necessarily going to come down on any particular one, but we'll look at the different ways of this question. So I think we can say that the way that the book is written is it's meant to be shocking, or it's meant to have shock value. It's very, very candid and using very candid language, and it definitely succeeded in being shocking to all of its contemporary readers. And so people ended up immediately kind of asking, does Machiavelli actually believe all of these things that he's advising? When we dive into his other works, so The Prince is a very short work. He has written many, many more voluminous other works. More of Machiavelli's thought is revealed in these longer political works, especially the discourses on Livy. And in these things, where he's taken essentially as a Renaissance man, as a classicist, he's taken the ancient historian Livy's history of the ancient Roman Republic, and so the rise of the Roman Republic, and taken those books and commented on them. And in doing that, it's very clear from the different things that he applauds and not that Machiavelli is a committed Republican, as opposed to a person who wants principalities to be, in charge of states. And so, because of this, later philosophers like Rousseau and then many others in the 17th century all began to view The Prince as actually a biting satire written to criticize absolute monarchies. So essentially, he says that because, as they're reading it, because Machiavelli says princes have to do all this kind of evil in order to maintain principalities, it's actually in general a argument against principalities, and so they read it anyway as a satire. However, there's other possibilities too. So we talked about here, maybe here's a Machiavellian in our sense of the word motive. So although Machiavelli was a Republican, the Florentine Republic had fallen to the princely rule of the Medici family, and so obviously the dedication, the beginning of The Prince, Machiavelli says that he's going to leave out all of his discussion on republics and focus on principalities. And really, even in the dedication and everything, his stated motive is to get back into power as an advisor to the new prince, meaning then that he was probably personally willing to compromise his ideals, which is to say his republicanism, for the sake of being in power in the new state, which was a princely state, right? And so if so, that's a Machiavellian motive, maybe. However, neither Giuliano, who was the original prince that the book was written for, nor his nephew Lorenzo II, to whom the book was eventually dedicated, seem to have read the book. They thought of Machiavelli as a Republican, and they weren't interested in having him be part of their, they couldn't trust him. He also then, therefore, never got the job he hoped, and he actually ended up living out his life in exile in his estate. So out of, not that far away exile, but anyway, exiled from the halls of power. So out of politics then, he continued his work as an author, as a Renaissance man, and actually one of the things that he was doing was he was a very successful playwright, and in his own lifetime he was much more known for that because his book, for example, The Prince, is published posthumously. So he died in 1527 at the age of 58. So here's another Machiavellian motive that different scholars have pointed out. So one of the more central examples in The Prince of a successful prince that Machiavelli dwells on is one of Cesare Borgia, the Duke Valentino, Duke of Valentinois. Anyway, I think he calls him Duke Valentino, who was the son of the Borgia Pope Alexander VI. So in his dwelling on this very amoral, ruthless leader, Cesare Borgia, who commits a big massacre of all of his potential enemies and all kinds of other ways where essentially his entire rise to power was based on his father, the Pope, despoiling the church in order to aggrandize his own family and to give lordship to Cesare. So Cesare here built up that principality from scratch using that influence of the Pope, his father. And so the intended audience of the prince, as we mentioned, Giuliano de' Medici, found himself in that same situation where he has that same potential resource, which is to say a Medici Pope, right? And so building on that Borgia model that Machiavelli is noticing here, at the time the Medici return to power, they have this Medici Pope, and Machiavelli, I think, or a lot of people think anyway, as such an astute political guy who is seeing all the different power potentials here, thinking back to that Borgia model, he's seeing that there is a real potential here to accomplish something. So the Borgias, who had come initially from Spain and so therefore didn't have a huge power base outside of the papacy to be drawing from, were only able to accomplish so much, which was actually pretty impressive, with this particular model of Cesare that Machiavelli outlines. The Medici, by contrast, in charge of Florence, one of the larger powers on the peninsula, and the papacy potentially had a lot more going for them if they wanted to build out that state and expand it a lot farther using those power bases. So at the conclusion of The Prince, we saw that Machiavelli urged this potential be harnessed for a particularly cherished goal. And so he writes here that the time is ripe. Having carefully considered the subject above, this is at the end of the book, of the above discourses, and wondering within myself whether the present times were propitious to a new prince, and whether there were elements that would give an opportunity to a wise and virtuous one to introduce a new order of things which would do honor to him and good to the people of this country, it appears to me that so many things concur to favor a new prince that I never knew a time more fit than the present. So he is seeing with this confluence of things that there's a lot going on here that potentially we could accomplish something important here. Using that same Borgia model of Cesare and Pope Alexander used to build up their power, Machiavelli believes that Giuliano de' Medici and Pope Leo could build up a principality that is then used to drive the French and Spanish and Holy Roman Imperial invaders from Italy and potentially unites the Italian peninsula. He says, this opportunity, therefore, ought not to be allowed to pass for letting Italy, as at last, see her liberator appear. Nor can one express the love with which he would be received, this prince who liberates Italy, in all of those provinces which have suffered so much from these foreign scourings, with what thirst for revenge, with what stubborn faith, with what devotion, with what tears. I'm sorry, when I was saying that, I was thinking of Cheney saying that how people be greeted in Baghdad as liberators, right? But anyway, so in this case, though, they probably would be happy to get rid of the Spanish. So anyway, so it's a different thing. What door would be closed to him? Who would refuse obedience to him? What envy would hinder him? What Italian would refuse him homage? To all of us, this barbarous dominion stinks. So we hate the Spanish and the French and the Germans being here. Let therefore your illustrious house, the Medici, take up this charge with the courage and hope, with which all just enterprises are undertaken, so that under its standard our native country may be ennobled. So this idea then, going back again to all of these warring different powers, going back a whole long time since all the way back to when the Lombards first came into Italy and divided essentially the territory between Lombard kingdom in the north and principalities in the south, and the rest being Byzantine enclaves. From that point to when there is a French intervention under Charlemagne, or Frankish intervention, and the northern portion of the kingdom is integrated into the Frankish Empire. From that time on, Italy has been completely disunified, and so it hasn't known anything since hasn't known unity since the Ostrogothic kingdom. And so Dante, before generations and generations before Machiavelli and other medieval Italians, hoped that Italy could find unity under a just, powerful, Holy Roman Emperor. So that had been kind of the dream as they are writing about the Constitution and their hope for how to actually bring peace and justice to the different warring states of Italy. But that possibility had long ago been dashed, by Machiavelli's time. So desiring that same kind of goal, Machiavelli here is urging that there needs to be a native Italian prince to put this thing together. And so despite his Republican sensibilities, Machiavelli then saw the potential here as perhaps too good an opportunity to pass up. And so when you have this kind of political calculus that you can do in your head and you see this going, you maybe say, okay, let's go for it, that kind of thing. Also, he's also perhaps in the right place at the right time, if they had hired him, is what he thinks. So with that then, those are as I kind of see it, are kind of some of the different possibilities of how we can understand what was going on with this book. But we also probably are going to have lots of discussion afterwards about what we think of Machiavellianism, or about the different ideas that he had, both for politicians and then also how politics has gone subsequently based on that. So, thanks. Since we have all the seats full, let me take a picture of you guys, okay? Thank you. Questions or comments, or?
Do you think in more modern...
Oh, wait, we gotta...
Yeah,
I have it.
Do you think in more modern terms he could be called a pragmatist?
Yeah, I think that he is definitely seen as being one of the founders of pragmatism and real politics as principles. So people draw back to him. And so in part because there was this whole period of time when philosophers chose to read, and maybe with justification or not, we have to decide, but anyway, chose to read the Prince as a satire or an anti-principality work. He was quite applauded by many of the, let's say, the modern materialists who saw him as having realistic politics and also pragmatic politics, and so you can see him as a precursor for pragmatism and utilitarianism. Let's go ahead and.
Question, Valerie, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We need to. Can somebody, Shaheen? Can you do that? Thank you. I'm sorry. No. She's passing the microphone. I'm sorry, because it's hard for me to. If I hold it, it'll make a noise.
I don't know if you covered this in the first 20 minutes, but I understand that Machiavelli really shifted the notion of what virtue was to, in some ways, it was back to a more Greek idea, I do believe, rather than the expressly Christian virtues of love and
Right.
and forgiveness and generosity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In some ways, one could say it was kind of this is debatable, but a somewhat more feminized sort of emphasis that he and I think contemporary writers who analyze this works related the word virtue to vir, like the
right.
masculine, traditionally that is masculine qualities. So virtue became more like a quality or a talent. He uses the word virtuoso in that respect. So somebody who was very talented at being a military leader was, in that respect, had those virtues. And so it was a real revolution, or at least he attempted to carry out a revolution in how morality, or not so much morality, but what the word virtue meant.
Yeah.
And then another comment is that it said that he was in some ways instrumental in the sort of in the building up of the notion of what is the modern state. Like he's a precursor of the idea of the state as an actor. In some ways, the prince represents the state as an actor, like Louis XIV said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. But then later, the state comes to play that role, and in some ways, modern states. It's been said that they're kind of immoral, that there's no. That it is pragmatism. Yes, somebody here pointed out.
Yeah. So. On the first one, on the definition of virtue, one of the things that happened when Renaissance classicists started really studying the classics and started really reinventing or becoming reawakened to classical Latin as it had been written. I mean, one of the things that happened was they killed living Latin, so medieval Latin as it had evolved ceased to be a living language, and instead they revived the understanding of how Latin had been spoken, and therefore were much more aware of actual definitions, meanings, and etymology. And so, in that sense, because, like you say, the word virtue, in Latin comes from that vir, like you say, the word for man, and so it's essentially initially meant manliness, but had come to mean all of these Christian virtues, peace, charity, and all those kind of things. You're definitely correct. I mean, we can just have seen it as we were reading through this text, and we were seeing that Machiavelli was talking about like these criminal virtues, and so this would have been completely out of context of how the word had been used by Christians for all of this time. And instead what he's essentially saying is a person's capacities and talents, even if they are criminal talents, right? And the second one was the state. And so,
the idea of the state as an actor.
yeah, so I like that. So essentially, because he starts to be at the center of all of this thought, the conversation comes forward for, in the centuries afterwards. So even when, as people are starting to have these more modern kinds of states, so for example, when Frederick the Great of Prussia is busy creating a strong state, government-centered state that is trying to advance and grow and everything like that, Prussia that ultimately becomes the German Empire, the very first thing that he does is he writes one of the things that he does is he writes a complete refutation, point by point of every precept that Machiavelli has. In other words, he's got Machiavelli on the brain, and all of Frederick the Great's critics kind of said, well, this is really hypocritical because this guy's really pretty Machiavellian. But in any event, he felt the need to write a refutation for it. So these kind of things, he's definitely a part of all of that conversation. And you had,
Me?
yeah.
Well, there's one aspect I was telling people once. I wrote a little paper and did a little study of Machiavelli once upon a time. I was also interested in Gramsci's idea of Machiavelli, and I think you miss one important aspect of Machiavelli's thinking: the idea of the armed prophet.
Oh, yeah.
Basically saying, you know what I'm not talking about. Like you have to have some sort of a genius who is also able to defend himself and impose his will to be able to create any kind of reform that can lead to an actual republic.
Yeah.
And that's what Machiavelli was always all about. He thought eventually this prince would become the sort of iron prophet who would not only drive the foreigners out of Italy, but also create his idea of an ideal government, which was a republic.
Mm.
And
so he's hopeful that, in other words, that maybe that a prince starts this off, but then eventually this would evolve into a republic, or he'd even create the republic. Yeah. So he definitely, like you say, that's a good point. So that he has the examples whenever he's talking about the founders, of states. And I guess in this case, if Italy were to become a unified thing, it ultimately is almost a new state founded. Like you say, he has the examples of like Moses and Romulus, and he calls Moses essentially, a founder of a state, but an armed prophet, like you say.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Armed prophet.
Yep.
And later in the last century, there's this communist philosopher from Sardinia called Gramsci who thought that the Communist Party, especially the Trotskyite version of it, should learn how to act as a sort of armed prophet, and instead of just trying to mess things up and create another dictatorship, work at creating a real democracy. There's also this increasing idea in political philosophy is something called dicta blanda, especially in Latin America, the idea of a dictatorship set up to create the institutions that can lead to a democracy, because you're not going to just go, they have enough experience understanding you're not just going to go snap from a totalitarian state or a dictatorship or a class system where everybody, where you have a ruling elite, into a democracy overnight. You have to build the institutions, and you're going to have a sort of an enlightened dictatorship, or dicta blanda, as they call it in Latin America, to create that, or as Gramsci called it, the sort of party as iron prophet, or maybe as Machiavelli was talking about the iron prophet. And that is an idea that interests me a lot. And I thought you might have got into that more, but
Yeah, it was hard to decide what exactly we're going to focus on, but that's a neat point. I like that. Thank you. Okay, who was next? I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to mention that Machiavelli recommends that you don't disarm the people you take over,
Yes,
because that gains their confidence.
right.
That doesn't sound like Gramsci and those communists, right? I mean, by far, right? And also he recommends that you don't even build a castle, because if you're smart enough, you have them on your side.
Right,
Because if you build a castle, it means that you're going to be attacked, right?
right.
And really, I don't know. I've read Gramsci. I've read Gramsci as well. I've read Machiavelli quite a bit, most of his works, and really, I think he was a person who did not believe in any kind of a princely state. Like
Okay.
he was definitely against it.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a tongue-in-cheek advice to Medici, because he was trying to get a job, right?
Yeah,
And because in the Medici had good reason to despise him, because he was involved in a previous regime,
right.
which kind of threw them out.
Yes.
And so I think like this interpretation with Gramsci, I don't know. I think Machiavelli has been given a bad rap over the years. I think if you read him carefully, the stuff that he says is so well crafted. Like
Yes.
it's beyond just vulgar realism. I
Right.
think there's a deep wisdom in there, and he recognizes there's a certain weakness in human nature.
Yes.
And you have to take that into account when you do politics. And to be idealized in these utopias, they fail because they have this utopian state. And then they end up killing millions of people because somehow they have a better system than somebody else, right?
Yeah.
I think he would have been totally against all of that, right?
Yeah. Neat. I like that. That's a good defense of the idea that it's a satire or written a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, I like that. Robert.
It's almost looking at his face there. He's looking in to find out where your greed exists.
Okay.
And can he draw that out? And once he can draw your greed out, then we can negotiate with your greed.
You're saying the portrait artist has kind of captured that in him?
Yeah, he's trying to fish something out of the people he's trying to influence.
Okay.
And greed just came to mind as, because everybody's kind of greedy they want more than their share. And so once that's out, then he can say, well, we can't give you all of that, but we can probably tell you that we'll give you most of it. Tell them what they want to hear.
Okay.
That's one of his lines, isn't it?
I'm not remembering that as his precept, but anyway, I think that people, greed is a common motivator, and people may have that as but that you would have to be taking into account when you're having any kind of work of political theory, right? So in that sense.
Yeah, I was going to say that virtu and virtue are quite different. Henry VI had virtue; he did not have virtu.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an exact English equivalent, but it's certainly a matter of strength of character, the ability to make yourself respected, the quality of a leader that makes people follow him. If you don't have that, forget it.
Yeah.
Go and do something else. Who was it you said who had was reputed to have the prince at his bedside? Henry VIII?
Oh, Henry VIII, yeah.
Yeah, well, Hitler and Trump is
Well-
reputed to have Mein Kampf at his bedside. Who knows?
Yeah.
Nietzsche's way too subtle for
I mean, Mussolini said he wanted to write a dissertation on the prince or something like that, although it isn't clear that he'd actually read it. But anyway, it was something to say that's shocking, maybe.
John, do we know how torture influenced Machiavelli's thought, his writing in any way, or is there no known repercussions from that in his work?
Right. So I guess I'm not aware of it for sure, but you can certainly, as you were reading a text that's written fairly soon after that, or maybe in the immediate aftermath of it, it may well have. I mean, I think that when you actually are undergoing torture. I think he had some kind of, it was a torture that they do with rope or something. I don't know the whole details of it, but I would think that would be in your mind, and you'd be thinking about that. So I don't know, and I haven't speculated on what it was, but we could just say that it is written kind of in the immediate aftermath of. I think that maybe one of the things that we can kind of see at the end, where he's talking about fortune, and he's talking about people who are blaming their fall from power on fortune, and then he kind of even goes through a very kind of macho, sexist statements against fortune as a female, personification. He may be thinking of his own, situation of this fall from fortune, where he had been, at this very high position in the government, doing exactly what he would have liked, honored and respected, and this kind of thing. And now he's to a place where he has nothing. He's been tortured. Well, he wasn't deprived of his property, but anyway, where he isn't in that position that he is. And so, all of that makes its way into the book, into a discussion of fortune. And so possibly also the torture is maybe affecting also what he's written. Don't think so? I don't know.
That was common practice in those days. It was very normal torture.
Yeah, torture is normal in those days, but does it still affect you when you then write, or you just say, oh, well, everybody gets tortured?
To his friend who's the Pope, who gets him exonerated.
Do you want to make the comment?
Sorry, he wrote a letter to his friend, and he says, you can never have enough friends in high places.
Yeah.
And so he had that planned as well, and that got him stopped being tortured.
Yeah.
And got him on, not the good side at least, to do
neutral
this.
or whatever.
Yeah, so I don't think it was a big event.
Okay. Bogdan.
I think he has a point there. If everybody around you is evil, or if there's tyranny all around, then it's hard to maintain a sense of idealism in the face of that. It represents a moral dilemma for, let's say, the United States, when other countries or empires are actually tyrannical or non-democratic. So can it maintain its purity when there are other, like Russia and China, are?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the answer has been no, right? It can't maintain.
Evil.
So the question is that how can you, in this in the environment that everybody finds themselves in, and so Machiavelli is suggesting that there's a environment where everybody is being so evil, or this is maybe part of human nature, that there's this sense of realism. That said, though, if you read through his much more elaborate political thought on about republics and things like that, though there has to be a sense of institutions having ways that are able to work. By balancing out some of these things, these negative qualities, in order for in that sense, he's listed as a person who influenced, for example, the founding fathers of the American Republic, constitutionalists, where they are interested in having checks and balances. In other words, where they assumed that you can't put all power into one person, because there has to be a judiciary that is going to stand up to him, although that can obviously fail, as we've seen recently. And in theory, you have another check of balance of the legislature, which is also not supposed to simply kowtow to the leader. It's also supposed to provide a check. And so that was the goal, because any independent one power only, that is entirely unchecked, could immediately have this flaw, right? Whereas if they're competing against each other, then theoretically, when the evil's going to be there, there's a check on it, right? Well, we can continue. You want more?
I'm just thinking, John, that there's so much of Machiavelli on the negative sense in our papers today. Maybe you could comment on that. I'm thinking primarily of Assad in Syria, who believes gassing his own people just is a means that justifies the end, i.e. state security.
Yeah.
And I think you see it in Putin's Russia as well. So whether Machiavelli was a Republican in the overall sense, I think you see really the evil sense of him today in several state leaders, and I'm really thinking about Assad and Putin.
Do you want to comment, you're saying?
Well, can we get to
Here, wait. You have to have the microphone to comment.
We're talking about, a brief comment, we're talking about, if we're going to talk about things, how about we talk about things that are actually occurring and are real instead of make-believe world created by establishment news, and especially about Assad, Putin, and people like that, and things that have nothing to do with the actual reality of what's going on in those places, you know, like the real.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean, because Assad is in charge of a country and Putin is in charge of a country.
I think, you know, I mean, you either read, you get your news from actual news sources, or you get it from the official propaganda, get it hammered into you by the official propaganda line out of Assad does this, Putin does that, you know.
Okay.
That's something that annoys me. I wish people would, first of all, get the facts of the situation.
Okay, well,
From
let's move on. Let's move on, because
But anyway, we're talking. It just annoys me to hear this kind of thing. You know.
Because Assad and Putin aren't really the topic anyway.
No, but
Machiavelli does talk about
learn.
looking. He says you've got to be prepared to do bad things, but you have to look good.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of a great deal of the history of the United States and from other countries in my lifetime. They did awful things, but they didn't publicize them, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
They came out very, very slowly, bit by bit. And another thing, I don't know if Machiavelli said this explicitly, but he seems to have realized that a ruler in doing bad things can go too far and cause the people's hatred of him to overcome their fear. And I'm thinking of the demonstrations in hundreds of cities and towns, including this one on Saturday, about the mistreatment of children.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, what I would say is that one of the things that seems like we're now in a place that is beyond, you know, like if we take Machiavelli, what he actually meant aside, and we get to our place of where we have understood, let's say, Machiavellian politicians to be, like you say, that there has been this expectation in the past, let's say all the way up through Nixon, that you are supposed to, you're supposed to seem to be honest, and you're supposed to present, you know, all of these kinds of even Christian virtues and this kind of things in the Christian West anyway. And when you may well be doing all kinds of, let's say, evil things for realpolitik that only come out, like you say, when the Watergate files break and we understand what's happened. But today, I do kind of feel like we're in a place where that's, you know, past where anybody, you know, where somehow anybody cares anymore. So where you can now be just very openly and kind of flagrantly amoral and get applauded, you know, and continuously, you know, have everything you say be a lie, and but everybody knows it is, and you even say it yourself that it is, you know. I mean, this kind of a thing where you contradict, in the case of the tweets, you contradict what you said just yesterday, right now, you know, and this kind of thing. And so it is kind of a strange thing where it is no longer, at least even the overt, if you were reading it as a serious text, it's no longer the overt Prince playbook that it seems to be in play, because people are able to, leaders are able to, you know, be so far beyond it. So what I think we'll do is we'll end kind of our formal broadcast and our discussion, and we can continue to talk all offline, and we can talk over snacks. And thank you all so very much.